They tried to evict me from my own home, but the HOA didn't realize I owned the lake beneath their mansions, the dock they fought to control, and the land their precious clubhouse stood on. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was a war between a clipboard-wielding HOA queen and a secret buried in my grandfather's files. By sunset, their $50 million development dreams would drown in the truth. They taped a notice to my door like I was some squatter who'd stumbled onto the wrong porch. No knock, no warning, just bold letters telling me I had 30 days to vanish. I nearly framed it because when people drunk on HOA power think they can rewrite reality with paper and fines, you know the drama's just getting started. Drop a comment if you've ever watched an HOA cross the wrong line. They might hold clipboards, but they play like mafia. The woman behind it all, a self-declared community curator who thought my modest cabin was ruining her lakeside brochure aesthetic. Bless her heart, she thought intimidation would be enough. She should have read the fine print, or better yet, the land records. By the time sun set that evening, the battle lines were drawn, not over paint colors or lawn height, but over who truly owns the ground everyone else is standing on. I never planned to be a cabin owner. My life in Seattle as a land surveyor kept me busy enough mapping out property lines for developers and private landowners. Grandpa didn't just leave me a cabin, he left me a landmine. 3 months ago, when he passed away, buried in his journals were deeds to 60% of the lake, a dock, and the HOA's clubhouse. But they'd spent years erasing his name, and now they were coming for mine. Grandpa Robert was a quiet, principled man who taught me more about land rights and property boundaries than any college course ever could. Know your land, Trevor, he'd say. Know every inch of it because if you don't, someone else will claim it. I didn't fully appreciate those words until recently. The cabin itself was modest, a 2-bedroom log structure built in the 1960s with a stone fireplace and a wraparound porch that offered stunning views of the lake. It wasn't fancy like the newer houses in the Silver Pine community, but it had character and history. The first weekend I arrived to start moving in my belongings, I noticed several residents giving my vintage pickup truck suspicious glances. The truck, also inherited from Grandpa, stuck out among the luxury SUVs and sports cars that lined the well-manicured driveways around the lake. I was unloading a box of books when a slender woman in her early 40s approached, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed to stretch her facial features into a permanent look of disapproval. Margaret didn't knock, she declared war. You must be Robert's grandson, she said, extending a manicured hand. I'm Margaret Winters, president of the Silver Pine Homeowners Association. We were so sorry to hear about your grandfather's passing. He was unique. Her stiletto heels clicked like a countdown on my porch as the way she hesitated before choosing that last word told me everything I needed to know about her true feelings. I trust you're planning to make some updates to the property, she continued. The community has evolved quite a bit since this cabin was built, and we maintain certain standards of appearance and upkeep for all homes visible from the lakefront. I set down my box and shook her hand, feeling the chill that had nothing to do with the spring breeze coming off the water. Nice to meet you, Margaret. I'm Trevor Thornton. I'm still settling in, but the cabin seems in perfect shape to me. Grandpa took excellent care of it. I could see her mentally cataloging everything she found objectionable. The natural wood siding that hadn't been painted in the trendy gray tones of neighboring houses, the native plant garden instead of manicured lawn, the stack of firewood neatly piled against the side of the house. Well, you'll be receiving our welcome packet with all the community guidelines. I'm sure you'll find it informative. Her smile never reached her eyes. We have monthly HOA meetings on the first Tuesday. You'll want to attend the next one to introduce yourself to everyone. As she turned to leave, she added, and you'll need to move that truck to the garage or rear of the property. Visible parking of recreational or vintage vehicles isn't permitted in Silver Pine. Before I could respond that the truck wasn't recreational, but my daily driver, she was already walking away, phone in hand, apparently photographing other properties as she went. I was still staring after her when a friendly voice called out from the neighboring cabin. Don't mind the Queen of Pine. She's on a power trip. The woman approaching had warm brown eyes and a genuine smile. I'm Ellie Collins. I teach high school biology in town and live in that blue cabin over there. Your grandfather was my favorite neighbor. He used to let my students come take water samples from his section of the lake for our ecology projects. We chatted as I continued unpacking, and Ellie filled me in on the neighborhood dynamics. Margaret and her husband Thomas had moved to Silver Pine about 5 years ago, and she had quickly worked her way onto the HOA board, then to the presidency. Ever since then, it's been fine after rule change, Ellie explained. They forced out 3 longtime residents already by making compliance so expensive and complicated that selling was the only option. Your grandfather was the only one who never backed down. She lowered her voice. Be careful with her, Trevor. The Winters have plans for this lake, and your grandfather's property was the last piece that didn't fit their vision. That night, after Ellie left, I decided to explore the cabin thoroughly. Midnight. Dust swirled in my flashlight beam as I cracked Grandpa's rusted safe. Inside, a map marked in red, the HOA's clubhouse, their docks, their power, all stamped Thornton property. My hands shook. They'd built their empire on my land. As I sifted through the papers, a pattern emerged. The HOA had been gradually attempting to claim portions of my grandfather's land through easements, rule changes, and outright encroachment. But what caught my attention were the original property deeds and survey maps. According to these documents, my grandfather didn't just own the cabin and its immediate surroundings. He owned 60% of the lake itself, the entire North Shore, including the community dock, and surprisingly, the land beneath the HOA clubhouse. I remembered a conversation from when I was 12, fishing with Grandpa from that very dock. A man in an expensive suit had approached, asking to speak with him privately. When the man left, my grandfather seemed troubled. That man offered me enough money to live like a king for the rest of my life. He told me all I had to do was sell this land. When I asked why he didn't take the offer, he simply said, "Someday you'll understand why I never sold an inch of this land. Trevor, no matter what they offered." The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. On my porch was a thick envelope marked Silver Pine HOA official notice. Inside was a 10-page document detailing all the ways my property violated community standards, with a helpful estimate for the required improvements totaling $18,000, all to be completed within 30 days. As I stared at the ridiculous demands, my phone rang. It was a text from Ellie. Got one too. Meeting tomorrow night to discuss community aesthetic concerns. You might want to be there. The Silver Pine Community Clubhouse was an impressive structure with large windows overlooking the lake, a vaulted ceiling with exposed beams, and expensive-looking furniture arranged around a massive stone fireplace. About 30 residents were already seated when I arrived for the HOA meeting, with Margaret standing at a podium at the front of the room. Beside her sat an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a stern expression whom she introduced as Victor Hayes, the HOA's legal counsel. I took an empty seat near the back, nodding to Ellie, who gave me an encouraging smile from across the room. As you all know, Margaret began, Silver Pine has been recognized as one of the most desirable lakefront communities in the region. Our property values have increased 20% over the past 2 years alone, thanks to our commitment to maintaining the highest standards. She clicked a remote and a slideshow began showing beautifully landscaped homes around the lake. However, some properties are not in compliance with our community guidelines, which affects all of our investments. The next slide showed my cabin photographed from an unflattering angle that made it look more rustic than it actually was. This property, recently inherited by Mr. Thornton, she gestured toward me without actually looking in my direction, requires significant improvements to meet our standards. The board voted 5-1 to erase my cabin from their perfect community. But as Margaret smirked, I slid a photo across the table, her husband, caught on camera, keying my truck. Your move, I said. The room went dead silent. Victor stood and adjusted his glasses. The HOA covenant gives the board authority to enforce compliance through an escalating fine structure and, if necessary, property liens and forced compliance measures. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than threatening people's homes. Additionally, the board can take direct action on visible violations and bill the homeowner for costs incurred. I raised my hand, and Margaret reluctantly acknowledged me. I understand the desire for community standards, I said, but my cabin is structurally sound, well-maintained, and environmentally appropriate for its lakefront setting. The natural landscaping actually prevents erosion and filters runoff better than manicured lawns. I turned to address the room rather than just Margaret. Plus, many of these required improvements would eliminate the historical character of a cabin that's been here since before silver pine was developed. Margaret's smile tightened. While we appreciate your concern for history, Mr. Thornton, the community has evolved. Your grandfather was granted certain exemptions due to his tenure, but those exemptions don't transfer with the property. The board's decision is final unless overturned by a 2/3 vote of homeowners. She quickly moved to the next agenda item, effectively shutting down any further discussion. After the meeting, a man about my age approached me. That was brave, speaking up like that. I'm Dave Wilson. I'm on the board, too, though sometimes I wonder why. He spoke quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Look, Margaret and Thomas have an agenda here. They're developing a new luxury community called Silver Heights on the hillside overlooking the lake, and they need silver pine to look perfect to attract buyers paying 7 figures for those homes. Your cabin doesn't fit their marketing materials. He handed me his card. If you need any help navigating the situation, give me a call. Some of us aren't happy with the direction things are going. The next day, I contacted Sarah Reynolds, a property attorney recommended by a colleague. She reviewed my grandfather's documentation with growing interest. This is quite extraordinary, she said, spreading the surveys on her desk. Your grandfather was very thorough in documenting his property rights and the HOA's gradual encroachment. Based on these original deeds, you're right. You own much more than just your cabin lot. She looked up at me. Have you told the HOA about this? I shook my head. Not yet. I wanted to confirm everything was legally sound first. Something my grandfather used to say came back to me. In a game of chess, you don't show your queen until the right moment. Sarah nodded. Because once they know, they'll immediately try to challenge it. We should gather more supporting documentation from county records before making any moves. She made some notes. Meanwhile, document everything they do. If they're planting things on your property or making changes without permission, that's trespassing. That advice proved prescient. The following weekend, I returned from grocery shopping to find a landscaping crew planting a row of uniform shrubs along my property line. When I asked what they were doing, the foreman handed me a work order from the HOA for community frontage beautification. I politely but firmly asked them to leave my property. The next day, I received a $500 fine for removing approved landscaping and interfering with authorized HOA maintenance. As predicted, the Community Beautification Initiative targeted my property specifically. I began finding HOA violation notices regularly, each more absurd than the last. My vintage truck was deemed an unauthorized recreational vehicle. My stack of firewood was a fire hazard despite being exactly as my grandfather had always kept it. The bird feeders were unauthorized wildlife attractions. Each violation carried fines ranging from $100 to $500. One evening while walking along the lake shore, I noticed something glinting in the trees facing my cabin. Upon closer inspection, I discovered small security cameras mounted on tree trunks aimed directly at my property. I took photos with my phone, then contacted Sarah again. This is getting out of hand, I told her. They're basically surveilling me now. This strengthens our case for harassment, she assured me. But Trevor, there's something else you should know. She pulled up a digital property survey on her tablet. I double-checked the county records. You don't just own your cabin lot. According to these surveys, you own 60% of the lake, the entire North Shore, including their dock, and this is the kicker, the land under their clubhouse. As this information sank in, I happened to glance out my window and spotted Margaret walking along my property line, taking photos of my cabin with a smug smile on her face. In that moment, I knew the real battle was just beginning. But when I confronted Margaret with the deeds, she laughed. Paper doesn't scare us. The next morning, bulldozers arrived at my dock. The morning after my meeting with Sarah, I decided to learn more about the history of Silver Lake and my grandfather's place in it. My first stop was the Silver Spoon, a diner in town where many of the older residents gathered for breakfast. Frank Miller, the local historian Ellie had mentioned, was easy to spot, a tall man in his 70s with a white beard and suspenders holding court at a corner table. Robert Thornton's grandson, eh? Frank's eyes lit up when I introduced myself. Well, pull up a chair, young man. Your grandfather was quite a character and the only person who ever stood up to the developers who wanted to turn this whole lake into a playground for the wealthy. Frank introduced me to several other longtime residents, all of whom had stories about my grandfather's stubborn defense of his land. Those fancy people in Silver Pine don't know it, but if it weren't for your grandfather, that whole North Shore would be 20-story condos by now. He blocked 3 major development attempts in the 1970s and 80s. Over pancakes and coffee, Frank explained how Silver Lake had transformed from a quiet fishing spot with a few cabins to an increasingly exclusive community. Your grandfather's land was the original homestead. The Thorntons were the first to build here back in the 1930s. During the drought of '77, when the lake receded, he legally claimed the exposed shoreline and part of the lake bed. Smart move. Gave him control of the waterfront development rights forever. That's why Thomas Winters has been trying to buy him out for years. Thomas Winters, Margaret's husband? I asked, suddenly making the connection. One and the same, nodded an elderly woman named Dorothy. Thomas is a developer. Built those cookie-cutter mansions on the South Shore. And now he's working on that monstrosity on the hillside. Silver Heights, they're calling it. Ultra-luxury homes with exclusive lake access. Except the access isn't so exclusive if they don't control the whole lake, is it? She winked at me. Your grandfather turned down $2 million from Thomas 5 years ago. Said the land wasn't for sale at any price. Armed with this new context, I returned to the cabin and spent the afternoon digging deeper into my grandfather's files. In the back of his desk drawer, I found a leather-bound journal documenting decades of interactions with developers and the HOA. Reading his precise handwriting was like hearing his voice again. Another offer today, this time from Winter's Development. Same song, different singer. They don't understand that some things aren't for sale. Later entries detailed the HOA's formation and gradual shift from a neighborly organization to what my grandfather called a developer's enforcement arm. He had meticulously recorded each encroachment on his property rights, the dock expansion that crossed onto his water rights, the removal of old-growth trees along the shoreline, the construction of the clubhouse on what had historically been part of the Thornton property. A knock at the door interrupted my reading. It was Ellie, accompanied by 3 other homeowners from around the lake. We saw what happened with the landscaping crew, she said. And we've all had our run-ins with Margaret's reign of terror. We thought you might like some allies. That night, with their encouragement still fresh, I drafted a formal letter to the town's civic affairs office, outlining the HOA's pattern of harassment and encroachment. I also sent a copy to the editor of the local paper, just in case. I wasn't trying to start a war, but I knew the only way to defend my rights was to stop playing defense. Over dinner, they shared their own stories of HOA overreach, excessive fines, arbitrary rule changes, and the constant threat of liens if they didn't comply. It's not about maintaining standards anymore, said James, a retired teacher. It's about forcing out anyone who doesn't fit their luxury vision. The next morning, the HOA sent a crew to cut what they called hazard trees. In reality, they were healthy old pines that had shaded my cabin for decades. I stopped them just in time, though 3 had already been damaged beyond saving. "This is harassment, plain and simple," Sarah said when I called her. "They're trying to make your life so miserable that you'll sell." Classic developer tactic. She advised me to file a police report for trespassing and property damage, which I did. When Officer Riley arrived, he seemed unsurprised. "We've had several complaints about this HOA," he remarked, taking photos of the damaged trees. "They're pushing the boundaries of what's legal." That evening, the HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted to increase my fines, now totaling over $3,000, for continued noncompliance and hostile behavior toward community improvement efforts. The meeting minutes, which Dave secretly shared with me, revealed their strategy: make compliance so expensive and difficult that selling becomes the only option. As I sat on my porch that night, watching the moonlight on the lake, I found myself wondering if fighting was worth it. Maybe I should just sell the cabin and be done with this battle. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a small carving on the porch railing, almost hidden by years of weathering. It was my initials, TT, carved next to my grandfather's RT. Beneath them was a date: the summer I turned 12, the last time we'd fished together before he got sick. Back inside, I returned to my grandfather's journal and found an entry from that same date. "Showed Trevor the property lines today. One day, this will all be his, and he'll need to protect it just as I have." Grandpa's voice kept echoing: "They'll gaslight you into thinking you're small. Pull the deeds, Trevor. Make them see the ground crack beneath their feet." A folded letter was tucked into the journal, addressed simply to Trevor. The paper was yellowed with age, but the message was clear: "If you're reading this, they've finally pushed too far. The time capsule under the dock has everything you need." I waited until after midnight, then took a flashlight and made my way down to the community dock. Underneath, attached to one of the support beams, was a rusted metal box. Inside, wrapped in plastic, I found a flash drive, original property maps with a county seal, and photographs documenting the gradual encroachment of the HOA onto my grandfather's land. The stolen deeds were gone, but they'd missed the backup. Hidden in Grandpa's fishing rod case, a USB drive labeled Silver Pines Grave. As I was examining these treasures by flashlight, voices drifted across the water. I quickly switched off my light and listened. Margaret and Victor were walking along the shore, stopping to look at my cabin. "The eviction notice goes out tomorrow," Margaret was saying. "He'll never be able to fight it. Once we control that property, the Silver Heights marketing package will be complete." "Are you sure this is legal?" Victor sounded nervous. The grandfather was notoriously thorough with his documentation. "The grandson is clueless," Margaret laughed. "He has no idea what he's sitting on. By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late." I smiled in the darkness. They couldn't be more wrong. The formal eviction notice arrived the next morning via certified mail, citing multiple unresolved covenant violations and unfulfilled assessed fines. According to the document, I had 30 days to either bring the property into full compliance, pay all outstanding fines, now totaling nearly $4,000, or vacate the premises. The notice was signed by Margaret as HOA president and Victor as legal counsel. Rather than panicking, I felt an odd sense of calm. This was the aggressive move my attorney had predicted, and it played perfectly into our developing strategy. I spent the morning examining the contents of my grandfather's time capsule. The flash drive contained scans of original property deeds, tax records, and correspondence with county officials confirming his ownership of the lake bed and shoreline. The photos showed the gradual construction of the community dock, bit by bit, extending onto my grandfather's water rights and the clubhouse foundation being poured on what was historically Thornton land. I called Sarah and arranged to meet her at the county records office. Brian Cooper, the records clerk who had been helping her research my property boundaries, greeted us warmly. Your grandfather was something of a legend around here, he told me as he spread out the original survey maps. Most people don't pay much attention to property lines until there's a dispute. But Robert Thornton knew every inch of his land and made sure every transaction was properly recorded. Brian confirmed what the documents already told us. My grandfather had indeed purchased the lake bed during the drought of 1977 when water levels were at historic lows, giving him control of 60% of the lake. He had granted easements for community water access, but maintained ownership of the land itself. Most importantly, the Silver Pine HOA clubhouse had been built partly on Thornton property with only a limited term lease that had expired 3 years ago. Your grandfather never renewed it, Brian explained. He filed a notice of lease expiration, but I guess the HOA ignored it, thinking he wouldn't press the issue. He stamped official copies of all the relevant documents for us. If you need a witness regarding these records, I'd be happy to testify. Robert Thornton was one of the good ones. Always did things by the book. Sarah was practically gleeful as we left the records office. This is better than I expected. They've built their entire community center on land they don't own, and they're using your dock without permission. Plus, they've documented their own harassment campaign against you through all these violation notices. We tapped the thick folder of HOA correspondence. It's time to develop our counterattack. Over lunch at a nearby cafe, we mapped out a strategy. We won't respond directly to the eviction notice yet, Sarah advised. Let them think they're winning while we gather more evidence and prepare our case. Meanwhile, I'll draft formal notices regarding their unauthorized use of your property. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I spotted a familiar face on my porch. Dave Wilson looked nervous as he handed me a flash drive. I can't be seen talking to you, he said quietly, but you need to see these emails. Margaret and Thomas have been explicit about their plans in board communications. They're trying to force out specific homeowners to improve community aesthetics before the Silver Heights launch. He glanced around anxiously. I've been documenting their actions for months, waiting for someone who could actually stand up to them. I think that's you. The emails were damning. Thomas Winters had identified my cabin as the primary aesthetic detraction visible from the Silver Heights overlook, and Margaret had outlined a step-by-step plan to force me out through aggressive covenant enforcement. Other emails discussed using HOA funds to make landscape changes to my property without permission, and even the strategic placement of cameras to monitor my activity. Most disturbing were the messages discussing the planned eviction, with Thomas writing, "Once we control the Thornton eyesore, we can proceed with Phase 2 of the development plan." That evening, I attended another HOA meeting, this time with a different approach. Instead of arguing or defending myself, I took detailed notes. After the meeting, Margaret approached me with a cold smile. "I hope you're reconsidering your position, Mr. Thornton. It would be so much easier for everyone if you simply brought your property into compliance. Or perhaps you'd consider selling. I know several investors who would pay market value for your rustic cabin." "I appreciate your concern," I replied evenly, "but I'm not planning to sell. My grandfather loved this place, and so do I." I gestured toward the lake. "It's an important part of Silver Lake history." "History doesn't pay the bills," she snapped, her pleasant facade cracking. "And it certainly doesn't maintain property values. Silver Pine is evolving, Mr. Thornton. Evolve with it or get out of the way." As I walked to my truck, I noticed a fresh scratch along the driver's side, a single word carved into the paint: leave. I discreetly activated the camera on my phone and walked around the vehicle, documenting the damage. Looking up, I noticed a security camera mounted on a nearby lamppost. Perfect. If it had captured the vandalism, it might identify the culprit. Through Dave, I obtained the security footage from that evening. The video clearly showed Thomas Winters approaching my truck, looking around to ensure no one was watching, then using his keys to scratch the threatening message. I sent the footage to Sarah, who added it to our growing file of evidence. While picking up supplies at the town hardware store, I ran into Margaret near the checkout counter. She smiled like we were old friends. I didn't smile back. Still trying to bulldoze your way through history? I asked. Her face froze. I suggest you reconsider, Mr. Thornton. A little compliance goes a long way. I held her gaze. So does a little sunlight. Good thing the town loves a story. Other shoppers paused. She turned and walked out without another word. The next day, a formal summons arrived indicating that the HOA was taking legal action to enforce the eviction. Sarah reviewed the documents with a confident smile. They've played right into our hands. Now we can bring everything into the open through legal discovery. She began preparing our response, which would include counterclaims for harassment, trespassing, property damage, and unauthorized use of my land. As we left her office, I spotted Thomas Winters in the parking lot of the lake's public access area, meeting with representatives from a construction company. They were examining blueprints spread across the hood of his luxury SUV. I didn't need to see the plans labeled Silver Heights Luxury Lake Access to know what they were discussing. The development on the hillside overlooking the lake was nearing completion, and they needed to finalize the exclusive lake access they'd been promising potential buyers, access that required controlling my property. Walking back to my cabin, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about defending my home anymore. It was about protecting my grandfather's legacy and the lake he had loved so much. The morning after receiving the legal summons, I hired a professional surveyor, a former colleague who owed me a favor, to mark the exact boundaries of my property based on the official records. By afternoon, bright orange survey flags dotted the landscape, many of them in surprising locations. Several flags stood in what the AO had been treating as community space near the shore. Others marked boundaries through portions of the landscaped community entrance. Most notably, a line of flags ran directly through the clubhouse building and across the dock. Margaret's reaction was swift and predictable. Within hours, she was at my door, a security guard from the HOA in tow. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, waving toward the survey flags. You can't just mark up community property on a whim. It's not community property, I replied calmly, handing her a copy of the official survey. According to county records, these markers accurately reflect my property lines, including, you might notice, the land under your clubhouse and dock. Her face flushed with anger. This is absurd. These boundaries were settled decades ago. Actually, they were, I agreed, just not in the way you thought. My grandfather granted an access lease for the clubhouse location, but it expired 3 years ago. As for the dock and lake access, he owned 60% of the actual lake bed, which gives me control over structures built on it. I handed her another document. This is formal notice that the HOA is currently trespassing on private property. You have 14 days to remove unauthorized structures or negotiate a new lease agreement. After they left, I called Dave to warn him about the likely emergency board meeting that would follow. Sure enough, within hours, Margaret had convened the board to discuss what she called a hostile takeover attempt of community property. Dave secretly recorded the meeting for me, capturing Margaret's increasingly frantic attempts to dismiss my claims and Victor's growing concern as he reviewed the documentation I'd provided. Over the next week, word spread through Silver Pine about the property dispute. Many homeowners, particularly those who had suffered under Margaret's regime, reached out to express their support. Ellie organized an informal gathering at her cabin where I explained the situation to concerned neighbors. I'm not looking to restrict anyone's enjoyment of the lake, I assured them. Unlike the current HOA leadership, I don't believe in using property rights as a weapon. I just want fair treatment and recognition of my legitimate ownership. Margaret responded by escalating her campaign against me. HOA landscapers attempted to remove my survey markers, only stopping when confronted with trespassing charges. A large truck mysteriously blocked my driveway one morning, requiring a tow truck to remove. The HOA newsletter included a special feature on community threats and property values with a poorly disguised reference to non-conforming properties that endanger everyone's investments. The situation took a darker turn when Thomas Winters approached me directly as I was checking my mail. "You're making a serious mistake," he said, his voice low but intense. "People who fight the HOA end up leaving one way or another. Save yourself the trouble and take a fair offer for that shack." When I didn't respond, he added, "This is bigger than you understand. Silver Heights represents a $50 million investment. We won't let some cabin-dwelling nobody derail it." That night, my water mysteriously stopped working. The emergency plumber discovered that the main line to my cabin had been deliberately damaged where it ran near the community access road. The repair cost $800, coincidentally similar to my latest round of HOA fines. Using my grandfather's extensive documentation and the new evidence of harassment, I filed a formal complaint with the county about the HOA's actions. The complaint detailed the pattern of targeted enforcement, the unauthorized entry onto my property, the surveillance, and vandalism, all tied to the effort to force me out for the benefit of the Silver Heights development. Margaret's reaction revealed her desperation. Rather than backing down, she doubled down. Community security patrols began driving past my cabin hourly. New violation notices appeared daily, each more absurd than the last. And in a particularly bold move, a community safety inspection was scheduled for my property without my consent. The situation reached a breaking point when I returned home one afternoon to find a construction crew at the community dock, which my survey had confirmed was mostly on my property. The crew was measuring and marking sections of the structure with spray paint. When I asked what they were doing, the foreman showed me a work order for a dock renovation project from the Silver Pine HOA, complete with a county permit bearing Margaret's signature certifying HOA ownership of the dock area. I immediately called the sheriff's office. When Deputy Hart arrived, he reviewed both sets of documents with growing concern. "This is a civil matter regarding the property dispute," he finally said. "But falsifying permit applications is another issue entirely." He instructed the construction crew to halt work until the ownership dispute was resolved. "I'd advise everyone to maintain the status quo until a court can sort this out," he told me. "This is going to get ugly before it gets better." That night, unable to sleep, I sat on my porch watching the lake. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, movement near the property line caught my attention. My security camera captured Margaret and Thomas examining my survey markers with flashlights, whispering intently as they made notes on a clipboard. Whatever they were planning, it was clear they weren't giving up without a fight. The county scheduled a hearing regarding the property dispute for the following month, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. News of the conflict spread quickly through the community, creating a clear divide. Those who had suffered under Margaret's strict regime rallied behind me, while others worried that any challenge to the HOA's authority might threaten their property values. The local newspaper picked up the story, running a feature titled "David versus Goliath." Cabin owner fights developer-led HOA, complete with photos of my modest cabin juxtaposed against the imposing Silver Heights development on the hillside. Sarah and I spent long hours preparing our case, gathering testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed the harassment campaign, organizing my grandfather's extensive documentation, and building a timeline of the HOA's escalating tactics. Through it all, I continued to live in the cabin despite increasingly uncomfortable conditions. The HOA had found ways to make daily life difficult. Security patrols shining lights in my windows at night, sudden maintenance that blocked my driveway, and constant photography of my activities. During my regular visits to town, I discovered something unexpected. I had become something of a local hero. The diner owner refused to let me pay for coffee, telling me anyone standing up to those Silver Pine snobs eats free in my place. Longtime residents shared stories of my grandfather and his stubborn defense of the lake's natural character. As our preparations continued, Dave provided a crucial piece of evidence: financial records showing that Margaret had been collecting rental fees for the community dock and boat slips, money that never appeared in the HOA's official accounts. Further investigation revealed a pattern of financial improprieties. HOA funds used for consulting services provided by Thomas's development company, inflated contracts with vendors who contributed to Thomas's political campaigns, and most damning, evidence that fines collected from homeowners were being diverted to a separate account controlled by Margaret. Margaret's response was swift and desperate. The HOA's attorneys filed an emergency injunction to prevent me from interfering with community property, seeking to have my survey markers removed and my cease and desist orders invalidated. The filing painted me as a vindictive heir attempting to hold the community hostage over outdated and invalid property claims. The day after the injunction was filed, I woke to find a small group of residents protesting outside my cabin, holding signs with slogans like "Protect Our Community" and "Don't Sink Silver Pine." Margaret stood among them, speaking animatedly to a local reporter about the threat to property values my actions represented. That evening, my security cameras captured Thomas attempting to remove my property markers under cover of darkness. When confronted with this evidence, the HOA claimed he was simply inspecting the markers to ensure they hadn't been tampered with, a transparent lie that further undermined their credibility. The situation took an even more serious turn when Dave discovered construction permits filed with the county for my property, permits I had never authorized. The applications, submitted by a company owned by Thomas, contained a forged signature purporting to be mine. The planned construction, a lake access facility serving the Silver Heights development, to be built directly on my lakefront property. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, Margaret requested a private meeting with me. Against Sarah's advice, I agreed, stipulating that we meet in the neutral territory of a coffee shop in town with Dave present as a witness. Margaret arrived looking uncharacteristically subdued, her usual polished appearance slightly frayed around the edges. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot," she began, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This dispute isn't benefiting anyone, and the negative publicity is harmful to the entire community. I'd like to propose a solution that works for everyone." She slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer letter for triple the market value of my cabin and property. "This is a very generous offer, Trevor. You could buy any house you want with this amount. Why fight to stay where you're clearly not welcome?" I closed the folder without examining the details. "This isn't about money, Margaret. It never was. My grandfather could have sold to developers decades ago and lived like a king. He chose not to because he understood that some things are worth more than money." Her pleasant facade cracked. "Don't be naive. Everything has a price. Name yours and this all goes away." "I already told you it's not for sale. Not to you, not to Thomas, not to anyone." I pushed the folder back across the table. "I'll see you at the hearing." That night, I found a final letter from my grandfather tucked inside a copy of Thoreau's Walden on his bookshelf. The letter explained his decades-long protection of the land as a mission to preserve what the lake was meant to be, a reminder that not everything in this world needs to be improved by human hands. My contemplation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass. Someone had thrown a rock through my kitchen window. Rushing to investigate, I discovered my front door ajar. The cabin had been broken into while I was meeting with Margaret. A quick inventory revealed that my grandfather's original property deeds and several key documents were missing from my desk. The security camera footage showed a figure in a hooded jacket entering the cabin and going directly to the desk, someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Despite the disguise, I recognized Victor's distinctive gait as he hurried away with a folder of documents. With the hearing scheduled for the following morning and key evidence now missing, I felt a moment of genuine despair. As I was contemplating my next move, my phone rang. It was Ellie, her voice urgent and excited. "You need to get to Frank's house now. You won't believe what he found." Frank Miller's small house was crammed with historical artifacts and documents from several decades of researching local history. When I arrived, he was practically bouncing with excitement. "I knew I had seen it somewhere," he said, leading me to a table covered with old county archives. When you mentioned the drought of 77 and your grandfather's purchase of the lake bed, I remembered documenting it for the Historical Society. He pointed to a yellowed newspaper article with the headline, Local Man Buys Lake Bottom During Drought. Beside it were official county records showing my grandfather's purchase of the exposed lake bed, complete with survey maps and legal descriptions. These are certified copies from the county archives, Frank explained. I was the county historian for 20 years before I retired. These documents have been in official storage all this time, completely separate from your grandfather's personal papers. I could have hugged him. Frank, they broke into my cabin and stole the original documents. This might save my case. Frank's eyes narrowed. Theft and breaking and entering? That goes beyond HOA bullying. He gathered the archives carefully. I'll bring these to the hearing myself and testify to their authenticity. No one can question county records or suggest you fabricated them. The Silver Pine Community Center was packed the next morning for the county hearing. The room had been divided, with HOA representatives and their supporters on one side, and those supporting my position on the other. Margaret sat at the front table with Victor and Thomas, all three looking confident despite the setback of the break-in not yielding all the evidence they had hoped to eliminate. As the hearing began, Margaret's attorney presented their case first, arguing that my claims were based on outdated and superseded documents, that the HOA had maintained and managed the disputed areas for decades without objection, and that my actions were disrupting an entire community's way of life out of personal spite. When it was our turn, Sarah began methodically dismantling their arguments. She presented the certified county records Frank had provided, along with testimony from Brian Cooper confirming the validity of my property claims. We showed evidence of the HOA's harassment campaign, including the security camera footage of Thomas vandalizing my truck and Victor breaking into my cabin. Dave testified about the financial improprieties he had discovered, and several homeowners described their own experiences with Margaret's targeted enforcement tactics. The most damning evidence came from Ellie, who had been collecting water samples from the lake for her high school biology class for years. Every spring, we test water quality around the lake, she explained. For the past 3 years, we have found concerning levels of chemicals near the new construction areas, chemicals consistent with the runoff from the Silver Heights development site. She presented her students' data showing elevated levels of construction pollutants entering the lake precisely where Thomas's development was located, evidence that their project was violating environmental regulations while Margaret's HOA looked the other way. During a break in the proceedings, Thomas approached me in the hallway, his previous confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. "This can go away," he said urgently. "Name your price. Whatever your grandfather turned down, I'll double it. This is just business. No need to destroy reputations over a property dispute." This stopped being just business when you decided to harass me out of my home, I replied calmly. When you vandalized my truck, when you had Victor break into my cabin. Those weren't business decisions. They were criminal acts. The commissioner's ruling was unequivocal. My ownership of the disputed property was confirmed, including the majority share of the lake, the north shore and dock, and the land under the clubhouse. All HOA fines and violation notices against me were invalidated. Most significantly, the commissioner referred the evidence of financial misconduct, document theft, permit fraud, and environmental violations to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. The judge didn't just hand me the lake, he handed Margaret a subpoena. As she fled court, reporters swarmed. "How does it feel," they asked, "to lose everything to the cabin you called a tumor?" In the weeks that followed, the consequences of the hearing rippled through Silver Pine and beyond. Margaret and Thomas resigned from the HOA board amid the pending criminal investigation. Victor agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for leniency, providing detailed evidence of the financial scheme and harassment campaign. The Silver Heights development faced significant setbacks as environmental regulators launched a full investigation into the pollution Ellie's students had documented. A new HOA board was elected, with Dave as president and a commitment to fairness and transparency. One of their first actions was to negotiate a proper lease for the portion of the clubhouse situated on my property, an agreement that included environmental protections for the lake and shoreline. Rather than exercising my right to remove the community dock, I worked with the new board to establish it as a properly permitted structure with open access for all Silver Pine residents. In return, the HOA agreed to support my effort to establish a conservation easement, protecting the undeveloped portions of the shoreline from future construction. I began renovating my cabin, maintaining its rustic character while making thoughtful updates. Solar panels replaced the aging electrical system, and native plant landscaping helped prevent erosion along my section of shoreline. Several neighbors, inspired by the natural approach, began converting portions of their own manicured lawns to native plantings. 1 year after the hearing, Silver Pine held a community celebration at the dock, now officially named Thornton Pier in honor of my grandfather. As I watched children fishing from the same spot where I had fished with Grandpa Robert decades earlier, Frank approached with a knowing smile. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. "You didn't just win a property dispute. You preserved his vision for this lake." That evening, I restored my grandfather's rowboat and rowed silently into the lake he loved. As the sun dipped below the trees, I felt his presence, steady as ever. Some people measure wealth in acres. I measure it in the quiet resolve to protect what matters. At HOA Stories, we don't just tell stories. We let the chaos speak for itself. If this one blew your mind, wait till you see what's next.